So very warm welcome to all to World Food Day 2014. My name is Olivier de Schutter. I have been the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food in 2008, 2014. My mandate ended a few months ago, and I am extremely grateful to Peter Ritchie, the director of Nourish Scotland, to have allowed me to say a few words on the occasion of World Food Day to contribute to this very important conference that Nourish Scotland has convened in Edinburgh. Um, I I worked on food systems for 6 years at the request of the Human Rights Council, and I would like to very briefly explain what are the key conclusions I arrived at and why the initiatives that are taken by Nourish Scotland in partnership with others seem to me of the utmost importance today. My conclusions basically are that we have developed in the 20th century food systems that were well tailored to answer certain questions that were posed in certain terms during that century, and particularly in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. But these questions are not anymore those of our 21st century. In the 1950s and 1960s, the priority was really to increase production in order to ensure that supply with match with increasing demand, and that the growth of agricultural productivity would remain aligned with demographic growth, which was very strong in the 1960s on a global level. And yes, we succeeded quite well in doing this, in producing more, in increasing volumes, by mechanizing production, by using massive doses of external inputs in agriculture, and by developing agro-industrial food systems that were heavily reliant on machinery, on pesticides and chemical fertilizers, on economies of scale in the production of large volumes of monocultures, in the paradigm that was at the time dominant. And that was extremely important at the time, and certainly it allowed us to avoid famines thanks to the increases in production that we've witnessed over the past half century. However, that came at a cost, and these costs that were implied by the productivist approach to food systems are only now becoming visible. But these costs are extremely real. First of all, we have environmental costs in reduction of biodiversity, in the exhaustion of soils, in the pollution of soils and groundwater, and of course in the growth of greenhouse gas emissions, for which agriculture bears an important part of the responsibility. Secondly, we have costs in rural development. The focus on large scale, on economic efficiency, on competitiveness on global markets of agriculture meant that many small-scale farmers, what our friends in Brazil call family farmers, were given no chances to succeed and were neglected, forgotten from public policies, without access to market, without appropriate support from the public authorities. They were simply not fitting with this productivist model that was being developed at the time, and the rural areas, as a result, were increasingly depopulated in many regions. And thirdly, the public health impacts were very important of this approach. We prioritized the production of cheap calories for the markets. We prioritized policies that would ensure that families would spend less of their budget on buying food, but we neglected entirely the links between agriculture, food, and health, and we forgot that the priority should be not just to keep people alive by giving them enough to eat, but also to nourish them, giving them access to adequate diets, sufficiently diverse, sufficiently balanced, for them to lead healthy lives. And as a result of us not taking that dimension into account, we now have in all rich countries a very impressive spread of non-communicable diseases, type 2 diabetes, cancers, cardiovascular diseases linked to unhealthy lifestyles, including unhealthy diets that are the result of these productivist approaches of the past. So that is what we've inherited from. And there is a broad consensus on both the successes of the past and the failures that I have just enumerated, the lacunae, if you wish, or the blind spots that were unfortunately handicapping these policies that were launched in the second part of the 20th century in particular. Despite the very strong consensus on what went wrong, many governments and other actors find it extremely difficult to reform the food systems that we have inherited from. And that is because these systems are very inert to change, very resistant to change. It is extremely difficult to overcome the obstacles to reforming them. Let me mention 4 reasons why this is so. First, the technologies, techniques, and infrastructures that have been developed over the past 50 years have been developed by and for the big agro-industrial players, the big commodity buyers and agri-food processors, and they are suited to the agro-industrial type of production. They reward economies of scale in the way commodities are being stored, in the way communication lines have been organized, in the way the logistics of the food chains have been thought out, in the way the processing has been developed. So we, if you wish, inherit from technologies, infrastructures that basically reward large-scale production, economies of scale, and not the kind of agriculture that would be smaller scale and more diversified. Secondly, beyond these technical obstacles, we have socio-economic obstacles. The system we inherit from is a system in which a small number of extremely powerful actors have come to dominate the system. This is the case for commodity buyers, is the case for the large agri-food processors, is the case for the large retailers. It is also the case for the large input providers, the seed and agrochemical companies increasingly concentrated to provide inputs to farmers. And all these actors benefit from the system as it has developed. They have acquired a dominant position and they have no interest in the system changing, in many cases blocking effective change as a result. So not only is this an economic position of dominance that they have, allowing them to crowd out any alternative that would seek to emerge, it's also a political position that they occupy, blocking change, and that is probably the third obstacle to change that I've identified. And then fourth and finally, there are cultural obstacles to change. We have been accustomed to depending on highly processed foods. We don't have time anymore to buy adequate foods, to cook them. We don't even have time to eat family meals in many cases, particularly for low-income groups within the population who have very busy lives and have long commuting times, making it difficult for them to organize themselves and to reconcile working with family life. We simply have lifestyles that make it extremely difficult to eat healthily and to eat an adequate range of diverse fresh foods that would be cooked at home rather than being prepared, processed by industrial means. So these are some of the reasons why the system, despite all its deficiencies, many of which are recognized by the scientific community and are now the topic of a consensus across the scientific community, this is why the food systems we inherit from are very difficult to change. So what can be done? Well, I would suggest that there are 3 directions in which the priorities should be set today. And I very much hope that an organization such as Nourish Scotland will identify ways in which we can move in these directions. The first direction is, if you wish, the interdependence between our lifestyles, behavior in the north and the reforms needed in low-income countries, in developing countries in the global south. We have ways of consuming, ways of eating, ways of producing, ways of trading that actually make it very difficult for reform to take place in developing countries in the global south. Um, uh, think of questions such as the overconsumption of meat in rich countries. Think of questions such as the encouragement to producing and consuming agrofuels, biodiesel or ethanol. Think of the waste, the huge amounts of waste and inefficiencies in our food systems. All this shows that we have now a system in which different populations with widely diverging purchasing powers compete for the use of the same resources, land, water in particular. And it's a system in which the luxury tastes of some populations compete with the satisfaction of the basic needs of low income populations elsewhere with a very weak purchasing power in comparison. And I'm very worried by the globalization of this competition for resources that has much to do with our unsustainable lifestyles we've developed in the global north that have not taken into account the impacts of our lifestyles on natural resources, in part because we could simply afford to buy the use of the resources that are located abroad in order to satisfy our luxury tastes. To give you just one figure, the EU imports soybean to feed its cattle in the EU, using up about 20 million hectares of land in countries such as Brazil, Argentina, and a handful of others to grow soybean, to grow feedstock for these animals that we consume in the EU. That kind of interdependency must now be recognized, and we should acknowledge that part of the answer to the global question of hunger and malnutrition really is in more sustainable consumption, more responsible ways of eating and producing. Secondly, I believe very strongly that we must rebuild local food systems, reconnect local farmers to local consumers, build stronger links between the rural areas and the cities. We have, over the past 50 years, done a lot to develop global supply chains, to improve the functioning of international markets, to favor international trade. And the result of this has been that the producers who succeed are the largest, the most competitive, those who have been able to adapt to this new environment, in which they've become providers of raw materials for the food processing industry, and in which they develop very large scale production that is heavily mechanized for the needs of global markets. Now, this shift from the role of farmers who were food producers to becoming commodity producers for the food processing industry is one that is troubling and worrying, and it is one that has been negatively impacting small farmers, what Brazilians call family farmers. And we need to encourage those farmers to succeed better by rebuilding local markets, by improving their access to markets. And by doing this, we will at the same time allow urban consumers to have access to fresh foods, to more nutritious diets, to a more diverse range of foods, rather than having these populations depend on the processed foods that are available on the shelves of supermarkets, foods that have a long shelf life, foods that have traveled over long distances, but foods that are not the most healthy and in some cases are in fact foods the consumption of which should be discouraged much more actively. So the second priority, I believe, should be to reconnect local producers with local producers for the benefit not only of improved incomes for small farmers, but also of more adequate diets, more nourishing diets for consumers. A third priority, it seems to me, would be to democratize food systems. I mentioned as one of the reasons why food systems found it very difficult to reform themselves that decision making was actually captured by the dominant players in the food systems as they have been developing. And I believe very strongly that we need greater transparency, greater accountability, greater participation in how decisions are made in the areas of food and agriculture, because we need these decisions not to be simply the result of the lobbying efforts of some major industry players. And this is unfortunately very much how things happen today. Democratizing decision by, for example, encouraging the establishment of food policy councils, by encouraging local level initiatives in which citizens can invent alternatives to the dominant mainstream food system, are extremely important. And I think that we should seek inspiration in the EU from what is happening in countries such as Canada, such as the US to a certain extent, where many municipalities have now developed food policy councils trying to rebuild these local food systems, or Brazil, where participatory democracy has a very long tradition. We must seek its inspiration from these experiences and try to democratize food systems at home in Scotland and elsewhere. And gradually, I do hope that the upper levels of government, the national levels of government, the European and international levels of decision making will support those local level initiatives that are democratizing, that are empowering, and that also can support the re-emergence of these local food systems. So these are some of the priorities I outline in the final report I presented a few months ago to the Human Rights Council. I very much would have liked to be able to be in Edinburgh today for the World Food Day 2014 and to support by being physically present Nourish Scotland. But again, my very sincere thanks to Peter Ritchie and his team, and I applaud this initiative, which I wholeheartedly support. Many thanks again, and enjoy World Food Day.